The final offensive against Berlin, the final push against the Nazi government, began at exactly 4 a.m. on Monday, April 16, 1945. At that hour, less than 40 kilometers east of the center of the capital, red flares exploded in the sky and gave way to an artillery barrage that shook the entire area, marking the start of the Russian attack. At the same time, troops from the US Ninth Army were withdrawing from Berlin. They were heading back west to take up new positions along the Elbe River between the towns of Tangermünde and Barbie. 2 days earlier, General Eisenhower had decided to halt the Anglo-American advance. He said that Berlin was no longer a military objective. For some American soldiers, the city was only about 70 kilometers away. As the attack began, people in Berlin waited amid the rubble, silent and afraid. The only thing that mattered was survival. Eating was more urgent than anything else. Going underground made more sense than fighting. Holding on made more sense than winning. This is the story of those days, the assault on Berlin and what happened to the city. Although there are parts about fighting, this is not a military report. It is what ordinary people, both soldiers and civilians, experienced, caught in the midst of the collapse, frustration, fear and abuse brought by defeat and the entry of the victors. In the northern parts of Europe, dawn comes early. Even as the bombers were moving away, the first rays of sunlight peeked out in the east. In that early morning calm, columns of black smoke rose over the neighborhoods of Pankow, Weissensee and Lichtenberg. With the low clouds, it was difficult to tell how much of the glow came from the dawn and how much was the reflection of the fires that continued to burn what remained of Berlin. As the smoke spread over the ruins, Germany's hardest-hit city by bombs was revealed, naked and broken. It was covered in soot, pockmarked everywhere, and littered with the twisted remains of collapsed buildings. Entire apartment blocks had vanished. In the heart of the city, neighborhoods no longer existed. In these empty spaces, what had once been avenues and streets were now paths filled with stones and dust, winding their way through mountains of bricks. Everywhere, what remained standing were windowless, roofless structures that seemed to stare skyward through gaping holes. After the attack, a fine layer of ash fell over everything, covering what had been destroyed. Amid the remains of brick and twisted iron, nothing moved except the dust swirling in the wind. It seeped into the famous Unter den Linden Boulevard, where the trees, now leafless, had their branches burned. Almost none of the area's banks, libraries, or elegant shops remained unscathed. But at the western end of that avenue, Berlin's best-known landmark, the Brandenburg Gate, though badly scratched and broken, still stood, its 12 large columns still holding. Nearby, on Wilhelmstrasse, where several government buildings and old palaces stood, the remains of thousands of windows glittered on the piles of stone. At number 73, the small palace that had once been the official home of the presidents before the Nazi regime had been gutted by fire. It had once been called a kind of little Versailles. Now, the water figures in the front yard fountain were smashed to pieces above the entrance, and the statues on the roof, representing Rhinelanders, were headless and bruised by shrapnel. A little farther on, at number 77, the building was damaged but still intact. All around, rubble was piled up. The 3-story, L-shaped facade had its light brown siding worn away. Above each entrance, golden eagles with swastikas still hung, but their surfaces were deeply scarred. Above, the balcony from which many shouted speeches had been delivered was still visible. It was the Reich Chancellery, Hitler's command post, still standing. Up the Kurfürstendamm, once a kind of Fifth Avenue in Berlin, was the twisted skeleton of what had been the Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church. On the burned-out clock tower, the hands were stuck at 7:30 and hadn't moved since 1943, when a single night of bombing destroyed more than 1,000 hectares of the city. A few meters away was what remained of Berlin's most famous zoo. The aquarium building was devastated. The reptile, hippopotamus, kangaroo, tiger and elephant areas, like many others, were in ruins. Surrounding it, the Tiergarten Park, over 600 hectares in area, was a lifeless field filled with giant holes from explosions, lakes of debris, and half-destroyed embassies. It used to be a forest with leafy trees. Now it was just burnt trunks. The largest ruins remained in the northeastern part of the Tiergarten, not from the bombs, but from the regime's own policies. The Reichstag building, the seat of parliament, was deliberately set on fire by the Nazis in 1933, and they blamed the communists. This gave Hitler the excuse to seize all power. Above the entrance, with 6 columns, the inscription, "To the German people," was still engraved. In front of the Parliament building, there used to be a group of sculptures. All were destroyed except one, a tall column of red granite and bronze. After the Reichstag fire, Hitler had ordered it moved. Now it stood a kilometer away on Charlottenburger Chaussee, right in the center of what was the east-west axis that crossed the city. When the sun rose that morning, the golden figure at the top of the column could be seen, a winged statue carrying a laurel wreath in one hand and a flag bearing the Iron Cross in the other. It was still intact, surrounded by the shattered city. It was the Victory Column. All over the city, alarms began to sound, signaling that the danger was clear. It was the 314th air raid against Berlin. In the early years of the conflict, the attacks were more spaced out. But now bombs fell constantly, the Americans during the day and the British at night. The amount of destruction was already enormous. More than 26 square kilometers were in ruins, 10 times more than the Germans had destroyed in London. More than 85 million cubic meters of ruins were estimated to lie in the streets, enough to form a mountain more than 300 meters high. Nearly half of the 1.5 million homes in Berlin had some form of damage, and 1 in 3 was no longer usable. The casualties were so many that the exact number would never be known. But at least 52,000 people had died, and more than twice as many were seriously injured, 5 times the number of casualties suffered in London. Berlin was already a flattened city, and the worst was yet to come. Despite all this, life went on, almost absurdly, among the wreckage. There were still 12,000 police officers on duty. Mail was delivered, newspapers went out every day, telephone and telegraph lines were working, garbage was collected. Some cinemas, theaters, and even part of the zoo were still open. The Berlin Philharmonic still offered concerts. Shops had promotions. Bakeries and markets were open every morning. Laundries, dry cleaners, and hairdressers had customers. The subways and elevated trains kept running, and on almost every street the cries of the same old flower sellers could still be heard, as if it were just another day. Despite so much disaster, almost 70% of Berlin's large factories continued to operate in some capacity. Nearly 600,000 people still had jobs. But getting to work was a challenge. It could take hours. There were detours, traffic jams, and broken-down vehicles. That's why many people got up early. Everyone wanted to arrive before 9 a.m., because that's when American planes usually appeared. That morning, in all 20 districts of the city, people emerged from their shelters like cavemen. They emerged from the subway, from public basements, from the cellars beneath their damaged houses. It didn't matter whether they were hopeful or afraid, whether they agreed with the regime or not. They all shared one thing. Those who had spent another night alive wanted to reach the end of the day just the same. The country was also fighting to stay alive. In this 6th year of conflict, the Nazi government was fighting with what remained of it. Hitler's plan for a 1,000-year rule had been shattered. Now the enemy was coming from 2 sides. The Anglo-American forces were crossing the Rhine, had passed through Remagen, and were approaching Berlin. They were about 300 kilometers away, and on the other side, by the Oder River, there was a more feared and closer threat. There were the Russians. Less than 50 kilometers away. It was Wednesday, March 21st, 1945, the first day of spring. A new song was playing on radio stations all over the city. This will be a spring that will never end. Faced with everything that could happen to them, the inhabitants of Berlin reacted in different ways. Some closed their eyes, hoping nothing would happen to them. Others took risks head-on. Many were filled with rage or fear, and some, seeing there was no way out, decided to bravely face whatever came. In the Zehlendorf neighborhood, southwest of the city, dairy farmer Richard Poganowska got up as always with the dawn. In the past, his job had been monotonous. Now it was what gave him meaning. He worked on the Domäne Dahlem farm, which was more than 3 centuries old and located in an elegant part of Berlin, a few kilometers from the center. In any other city, having a farm so close to the city center would be unusual. But not in Berlin. 1/5 of the city's area was forest, parks, lakes, and rivers. Still, Poganowska, like many on the farm, wished they were farther away, out of reach of the bombs. He, his wife Lisbeth, and their 3 children spent the night as usual, in the cellar of the farm's main building on Königin Louise Street. Sleep was almost impossible because of the noise of the anti-aircraft guns and the explosions. Like almost everyone living in Berlin, the milkman was exhausted. He didn't know which areas had been bombed that night, but he was certain they didn't hit the cowsheds. The cows were still alive. Nothing seemed to faze them. Amid the bombs and gunfire, they kept chewing as if nothing had happened, and somehow they continued to produce milk. This was something that struck him daily. Sleepy, Pogonovska filled her wooden cart with milk jugs, harnessed her 2 horses, Lisa, who was tan, and Hans, and, with her grey dog named Poldi at her side, began her route. Leaving the courtyard, she turned right onto Pacelli Alley and headed toward Schmargendorf. It was 6 in the morning. She wouldn't return until 9 at night. Tired, his bones heavy, he hadn't lost his straightforward way of speaking. For his 1,200 customers, he had become a kind of comfort. His route passed through 3 districts, Seelendorf, Schöneberg and Wilmersdorf. All were badly hit. Schöneberg and Wilmersdorf, being closer to the center, were almost razed to the ground. In Wilmersdorf alone, more than 36,000 homes were destroyed. Nearly half of its 340,000 residents were homeless. That's why the milkman's face, even if only for a moment, was a kind of relief. Even so early, there were people waiting for him at every corner. Lines were common for everything, the butcher, the baker, and even for water when the pipes were broken. Even though there were people, Pogonovska rang her large cowbell to announce herself. She had started doing this when the daytime attacks became more intense, and she could no longer go up to every house. For her customers, he and his bell were part of the landscape. That morning it was the same. He greeted his customers and gave them the exact amount indicated on their ration cards. He had known many of them for almost 10 years. They knew that sometimes he could give a little more. By adjusting the paperwork, he was able to give a little extra for a baptism or a wedding. It wasn't legal, but these days everyone took a risk. More and more, she saw people who were tired, tense, and quiet. There was no longer much talk about the conflict. No one knew what was really going on. And even if they knew, they couldn't do anything. Besides, there were already too many people having opinions. He avoided talking about it. With his 15-hour-a-day routine, he had learned not to think too much about the war. Like many, he had become almost immune to what was happening, but he still noticed things that gave him hope. For example, the streets were still clear. There were no barricades or tank traps, no cannons or soldiers digging trenches could be seen. Nothing showed that a siege was being prepared. Moreover, every day, as he passed through Friedenau, where several high-ranking officials lived, he looked at one house in particular. An important postal official, loyal to the party, lived there. They always left the curtains open, and from his cart, the milkman could see a huge painting hanging in the living room. It was a portrait of Hitler, his face serious and defiant. If things were that bad, he thought, that painting wouldn't be hanging anymore. He clicked his tongue to hurry the horses and continued with his work. Although the outlook was bleak, he saw no reason to panic. No part of Berlin had been completely spared from the bombing, but Spandau, one of the larger neighborhoods in the west, hadn't been hit as hard. Everyone expected a major offensive to hit at any moment. It was strange that it hadn't happened, since the city's largest arms industry was located there. In contrast to other areas of the center, where up to 70% of the buildings were destroyed, only 10% had been lost in Spandau. Still, that meant more than 1,000 unused homes. But compared to the other neighborhoods, it was still small. In the most damaged areas, a sarcastic phrase was repeated: "Spandau dwarfs are the last to go to the coffin." On the westernmost edge of Spandau in Starken lived a couple, Robert and Ingeborg Kolb. There had been no serious bombing raids there. The only explosions that had been close were the ones that missed reaching the airport. Their 2-story house, with orange and brown walls, a glass-enclosed porch and a garden, was undamaged. They lived with a tranquility that many envied. Ingeborg took care of the household chores. She prepared meals, tended the garden, and looked after their 2 sons, 8 and 10. Robert, 41, worked as an electrical engineer at Siemens. The company continued to operate normally, which was already unusual. Like other employees, he rode his bicycle to work every day, crossing paths where he could see collapsed houses and dusty streets. They both knew the end was approaching, but went about their days as if they were normal. Ingeborg organized the house and made sure everything was clean. Robert went to the factory, fixed engines, and made sure the power lines didn't fail. Sometimes at night they listened to the party speeches, which still said victory was possible. They no longer believed in it, but they kept listening. There were tense moments, of course. When the alarms sounded, they went down to the basement. They prepared the flashlight, blankets, and a small radio. They didn't talk much. They just waited for the danger to pass. Then they went up, swept the dust, fixed what was broken, and moved on. The neighborhood still had shops open. You could buy bread, although you had to wait in line. The butcher was still open for a few hours, and in the streets, some children were still playing. It was as if they were trying to pretend everything was fine, but everyone knew what was coming. The radio had mentioned the Russian offensive. Rumors spread of looting, abuse, revenge. People were starting to dig holes in their gardens to hide things. Others covered their windows with blankets and cardboard. Some neighbors were discreetly saying goodbye. They went to the countryside, to relatives' houses, or simply disappeared. In that seemingly absurd calm, many wondered the same thing: how much longer the city would hold out. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it, and meanwhile they continued with their routines, as if it were the only way to avoid going crazy. General Heinrici sounds the alarm. On March 13, 1945, Hitler decided to remove General Gotthard Heinrici from command of Army Group Vistula. He was a veteran, methodical, and quiet soldier. That day, he was placed in charge of the most fragile sector of the entire Eastern Front. Army Group Vistula was tasked with protecting the direct road to Berlin. Opposite it lay Marshal Zhukov's forces. No one but Heinrici knew what was coming. When he took over, the situation was disastrous. The army had fewer divisions than necessary, outdated weapons, incomplete units, and many without real experience. The defensive lines were weak and poorly constructed. There was no time to reinforce them. Heinrici started with the basics, moving his soldiers to more strategic locations. He also ordered trenches to be built, roads to be reinforced, and minefields to be laid. He knew this wouldn't stop the Russians, but it could delay them. From the first days, Heinrici realized the fight was lost. He could only buy time. It was no longer a matter of holding positions, but of slowing down the inevitable. He made this clear in his reports. If the enemy attacked with everything, there would be no way to stop them. The German divisions were exhausted. The soldiers had gone weeks without rest. There was a shortage of food, fuel, and medicine. Communications were constantly interrupted. The artillery barely functioned, and the skies were controlled by the Russians. Every movement was observed from the air. Heinrici was not a politician. He spoke little, but with facts. His reports were cold and detailed. He didn't try to please Hitler or sugarcoat everything. What he said was real. Because of this, he didn't sit well with some officers in the high command. At a meeting on March 20th in the command cabin at Zossen, Heinrici showed maps and explained the situation. He showed how the enemy was gathering forces, how they had detected tanks and heavy weapons, and how the Soviet troops were moving. He said the attack was a matter of days. No one contradicted him, but the atmosphere became tense. Some tried to change the subject. Hitler listened to everything in silence. Then he asked about the possibility of launching an offensive toward Kustrin. Heinrici said that wasn't feasible. There weren't enough troops for that. If units were pulled from the front, the defense would be breached. The only sensible thing to do was to hold and delay. After that meeting, Heinrici returned to his post. He ordered the positions to be improved. He ordered wood, sandbags, and barbed wire to be brought in. There wasn't much, but with what little remained, they tried to make a stronger line. At the same time, he reorganized what he could. He changed commanders, merged battalions, and assigned clear functions. His priority was to hold. On April 4th, a reconnaissance plane confirmed what they had already suspected. More than 1,000 tanks were amassing on the other side of the Oder. The Soviet divisions were moving quickly. Everything indicated that the attack was imminent. That same night, Heinrici summoned his unit commanders. He ordered them to evacuate the front lines by nightfall on the 15th. He said that no later than dawn on the 16th, the attack would begin. In his words, there was no drama, just facts. He calculated that, with luck, they could hold out for 5 days. After that, the Russians would reach the heart of Berlin. There was no way to stop that. German reserves were minimal. Mobility was almost zero. There was no air support. And orders from above were no help. On the 14th, Heinrici was summoned again to a meeting with Hitler. This time it was in the bunker. He entered unescorted in his wrinkled uniform. Hitler was already inside, along with Keitel, Jodl, and Goebbels. The room was small, dimly lit. A huge map hung on one wall. On it, positions were marked with red and blue pins. Hitler greeted it with a curt nod. Then he began to talk about a counter-offensive. He said that a shock group with SS units and panzer divisions was going to be assembled to attack the enemy's left flank. Kustrin had to be recaptured. He said that would change the course of events. Heinrici waited his turn to speak. Then he said that there was no possibility of launching such a maneuver. He explained that the Central Front could not be left undefended, that there were no tanks available, that even if there had been, the terrain was muddy and the vehicles would get stuck. Hitler looked annoyed. He interrupted. He said he had already given the order, that the soldiers had to obey, that it took will, not excuses. Heinrici lowered his gaze but maintained his point. He said the men were exhausted, that no one could fight without rest, without food, without ammunition, that this wasn't a lack of will but simple physics. Jodl intervened. He said morale was key, that history would judge them. Heinrici didn't reply, he just looked at the map. He mentally calculated the hours remaining. He knew that even as they spoke, the Russians were already ready to advance. When the meeting ended, he left the bunker without a word. He got into his car and returned to the front. He didn't sleep that night. He stayed in his barracks, reviewing the intelligence reports again. At 3 a.m. on April 16th, the sky lit up. The Soviet artillery began firing. It was the beginning of the end. The bombardment began with an intensity that surpassed anything seen before. Along the entire front, from the Oder River to the Silo Heights, shells rained down non-stop. Communication lines were cut in a matter of minutes. The most exposed trenches were ravaged by explosions. The positions Heinrici had ordered evacuated a few hours earlier were destroyed. The soldiers in the second lines waited in silence. They knew that after this firestorm, the advance of the infantry and tanks would come. The noise was so loud that it was impossible to speak. All you could see were mud-stained faces, fixed eyes, tense hands gripping rifles or grenades. Amid the chaos, Heinrici moved between the command posts. He didn't say much. He only asked about the situation, reviewed maps, and gave instructions. He was clear that the objective wasn't to win, but to delay. Every hour the Russians could be held back was another hour to evacuate civilians, to prepare Berlin, to attempt the impossible. At 5 a.m., the first reports confirmed that enemy artillery had broken through. In several sectors, Soviet troops were crossing the river. They were coming in boats, pontoons, and amphibious trucks. Behind them, tanks were moving. The ground was wet, but that didn't stop the advance. Heinrici showed no surprise. He had anticipated it. He said the priority was to avoid an immediate breakthrough. That counterattacks had to be concentrated on key points, not trying to stop everything at once. He ordered the last reserves to be used to plug the most dangerous gaps. By noon, the pressure was enormous. On the Silo Heights, the battle was hand-to-hand. German troops were fighting for every meter, but casualties were very high. Enemy tanks were rolling up the hills and smashing through the defenses. The ground shook with every explosion. The reports reaching Army Group Vistula headquarters were increasingly alarming. An entire division had been cut off. Another was out of ammunition. The telephone lines were cut. Only the radios remained, which sometimes worked and sometimes didn't. Heinrici remained in charge. He refused to evacuate. He said that as long as he could receive reports, he would continue to command. He called his officers together every few hours. He asked about morale, food, and the wounded. He ordered that the approaches to Berlin be held as much as possible. If those roads fell, there would be no other options. On the 17th, the situation was even worse. The lines had broken in 2 places. The Soviet troops had crossed in force. Attempts to slow their advance with flamethrowers and mines were ineffective. It was no longer a question of containment, but of preventing collapse. That afternoon, Heinrici asked to speak to the High Command in Berlin. Keitel answered by radio. Heinrici explained that if an orderly withdrawal was not authorized, the entire front would fall. He said they had to fall back to the outskirts of Berlin and form a last line. If they didn't, the Russians would reach the capital in a matter of days. Keitel said that wasn't possible. Hitler had given orders not to give ground. Any retreat was forbidden. They had to stand where they were. To retreat was to surrender. Heinrici didn't reply immediately. Then he repeated that if the order wasn't given, he couldn't guarantee anything. Keitel asked him to wait. He said he would consult. Hours later, the reply came. It was negative. The current position must be maintained. Heinrici hung up the radio. He gave the order to regroup what remained of his units and form a shorter line. He did this without waiting for permission. He said it was no longer a matter of obeying, but of preventing everything from collapsing. That night, several units managed to leave the hardest-hit sectors. They retreated to secondary routes. They burned documents, destroyed damaged equipment, and evacuated the wounded they could carry. Heinrici spent the night in a makeshift shelter with a map spread out on a broken table. He continued to plot withdrawal routes. Each line represented hours of life for the capital. On the 18th, there was no way to hide the truth. Soviet troops had reached Müncheberg. That left less than 60 kilometers to Berlin. Some enemy outposts were already visible on the outskirts. Observation posts reported that civilians were beginning to flee en masse. Cars with children, elderly people walking, unarmed soldiers mingled with the population. It was the beginning of chaos. In Berlin, the Central Command continued to act as if nothing had happened. Hitler gave speeches behind closed doors. He spoke of divisions that no longer existed. He promised reinforcements that no one saw. He gave orders for attacks from the north, from the south, from points already occupied by the Russians. No one contradicted him. On the 19th, Heinrici sent his last official report. In it, he stated that Army Group Vistula had lost almost half of its capacity, that there were no more reserves, that the enemy had broken through all lines and was advancing rapidly, that defense was no longer possible, and that if Berlin was not surrendered, at least the population should be allowed to evacuate. That message was never answered. The next morning he was informed that he was out of command. He had been replaced by General Kurt Student. There was no ceremony, no call, just a radio announcement. Heinrici didn't argue. He took off his helmet, saluted his closest men, and got into an unescorted car. He drove away from the front in silence. He had done his best. What was coming no longer depended on him. In the following days, Berlin became a battlefield. The streets filled with tanks, barricades, young and old soldiers, children from the Hitler Youth and elders from the Volkssturm. The city was heading for collapse, and Heinrici had already said all of this before it happened. Hitler's rage in the bunker. Hitler woke up later each day, sometimes at noon, sometimes after 2. He slept in a small concrete room with grey walls and sparse furniture. Sleeping next to him was Eva Braun, who had been with him since they took refuge in the bunker. Upon awakening, he had a light breakfast. Then he went straight to a meeting with his military team. In these daily sessions, they discussed the front, the troops, and maps full of markings. But Hitler no longer listened. While the Russians advanced from the east and the Americans from the west, he retreated into his routine. He walked hunched over, with one hand trembling. He sometimes leaned on his aide-de-camp, Otto Günscher, or on the table for support. His voice was weak, but he still shouted when he didn't like something. The generals who visited him knew it was useless to argue. Hitler continued to give orders to move divisions that no longer existed. He ordered tank counterattacks that never arrived. In his mind, the army was still strong, loyal, and willing. He refused to accept that most units were destroyed, disorganized, or trapped. General Bergdorf once brought him a report showing the Soviets were 30 kilometers from Berlin. Hitler tore it up without reading it. He said the Russians were exaggerating, that they hadn't really come that far, that the enemy was going to break at any moment. On another occasion, he ordered General Wenck, leading the 12th Army, to turn around and march toward Berlin. He was told that was impossible. Wenck had barely any men, no fuel, and was facing the Americans. Hitler insisted. He shouted that the fate of the Reich was at stake, that compliance must be achieved. When the generals didn't answer, he took that as a sign of approval. No one dared correct him. They knew if they did, they would be dismissed, or worse. Some were replaced within hours. Others were sent to the front as punishment. One of them, General Busse, said in a low voice that this war was no longer military, but personal. It was Hitler's war against reality. The atmosphere inside the bunker grew more tense every day. The walls were made of thick concrete. No sunlight entered. The air was thick, filled with cigarette smoke and the smell of bodies that hadn't been removed for weeks. Lamps were lit all day, making it impossible to tell whether it was day or night. Eva Braun tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy. She put on makeup, listened to music, and watched old movies on a portable projector. She invited the officers over for coffee in her living room. But no one could forget that bombs were falling outside, that the screams of the wounded in nearby hospitals reached the hallways. Sometimes Hitler would spend hours in silence. He stared at maps without blinking. Other times he talked non-stop, repeating old phrases. He said the German people hadn't been up to the task, that the failure wasn't theirs but everyone else's, that if Germany lost, it deserved to be destroyed. At a meeting on April 18th, just after the fall of Kustrin was confirmed, Hitler had one of his most intense outbursts. Keitel tried to explain to him that the lines were broken, that there was no way to hold back the Russians. Hitler interrupted him, shouting. He said he didn't want to hear excuses, that the generals were cowards, that no one had the courage. He shouted so loudly that he had to sit down. His hands shook. He drank a glass of water with difficulty. Then he abruptly stood up and left the room. No one spoke for several minutes. No one knew what to say. In the following days, his behavior became more erratic. He ordered all the bridges over the Spree destroyed. Then, the next day, he ordered them repaired. He said there were traitors everywhere, that someone was leaking information to the enemy, that the Russians couldn't have arrived so quickly without help. He had several officers arrested for disobedience. Some were shot without trial. Others disappeared. Everyone feared they would be next. There was fear of speaking, of moving, of writing anything on the barracks papers. Every sentence could be considered treason. Hitler's personal physician, Dr. Morell, began to notice changes in his health. He increased his dose of tranquilizers. He gave him injections several times a day. He also gave him vitamins, liver extracts, and stimulants. But nothing seemed to work. Hitler was exhausted. He shuffled. His left arm trembled constantly. His jaw clenched uncontrollably. Despite everything, he continued giving speeches. He gathered his officers and spoke of imaginary counterattacks. He said the Allies were going to fight each other, that the Russians would be defeated by the force of the German spirit. No one believed this, but everyone agreed. Silence was the only way out. April 20th was his 56th birthday. Eva Braun organized a small celebration. They brought him a cake. They sang him a song. Some officers gave him simple gifts, a pen, a book, an old medal. Hitler barely smiled. He said a few short words. He thanked them. Then he went to his room. That same day, he received his last official visit. General Keitel, Admiral Dönitz, and Marshal Goering passed by the bunker. They shook his hand. They congratulated him. They spoke for a few minutes. Then they went upstairs and left. They knew they would never see him again. On the night of the 20th to the 21st, Hitler paced the corridors aimlessly. He muttered random phrases. He asked about divisions that no longer existed. He gave orders to defend sectors that were already occupied. His aides took notes, but knew they could not carry anything out. At dawn on the 21st, General Weidling, responsible for the defense of Berlin, handed him a new report. It said that Russian troops were already within the city limits, that Soviet artillery was pounding the center, that the fighting was taking place street by street. Hitler didn't react at first. Then he asked about the 12th Army. He was told it was still to the west, unable to advance. Hitler ordered it to move. No one answered. Then he asked about Steiner. He was told Steiner should attack. Keitel looked down. Steiner had no troops. That unit didn't exist. That was when Hitler stopped abruptly. He banged his fist on the table. He shouted that it was all a betrayal, that his officers had deceived him, that no one was loyal, that everyone deserved to die. That scene was the Führer's last great explosion of rage. After that, he faded away. He spent more time alone. He spoke less. He slept more. He no longer met with everyone, only with a few. In the bunker's corridors, the silence grew. The sound of the bombing was constant. The walls shook with each impact. The floor creaked, wires dangled, lights flickered. Aides spoke in whispers. Cooks prepared simple meals. Messengers no longer arrived. No one went out, no one came in. All that was left was waiting. In his final days, Hitler no longer spoke of victory, only of punishment. He said the Germans had failed, that they hadn't fought hard, that they deserved to disappear, that he wouldn't surrender. He ordered all documents destroyed, papers burned, names erased. He wanted no record left. He wanted history to have no proof. Some officers tried to convince him to escape, of leaving the bunker, of flying south, of hiding. He said no, that he wouldn't flee, that he would die in Berlin. General Krebs visited him for the last time on April 25th. He told him the Russians were now less than 2 kilometers away, that there were only a few days left, maybe less. Hitler nodded. He said nothing. That afternoon he called his secretary. He dictated his will to him. He said he named Dönitz head of state, that he expelled Himmler and Göring from the party, that he had been betrayed by everyone. Then he locked himself in his room. Eva Braun accompanied him. No one knew what was going on inside. Only the radio could be heard, some music. The rest of the bunker waited. Thus ended Hitler's rule. Not with a speech, not with a battle, but with shouts in the darkness, with torn papers, with meaningless orders. The man who had controlled half a continent was left alone, trapped between concrete walls while the world outside collapsed. The collapse of loyalty, Göring, Himmler, and the silent betrayal. On April 20th, 1945, while Hitler was celebrating his 56th birthday in his bunker, Field Marshal Hermann Göring was in Berchtesgaden, southern Germany, at the residence known as the Eagle's Nest. From there, he closely followed the reports coming in from Berlin. He knew that the capital was almost surrounded. He also knew that Hitler was no longer giving clear orders. Göring was not an active military officer at that time. For months, his role had become symbolic. He had been officially designated as Hitler's successor should he become incapacitated. That decision had been written in 1941, so when he saw that chaos was taking hold of the government, he thought it was time to act. He sent a coded message to the bunker. In it, he said that if Hitler could not govern, he would assume command as established by party law. He said he expected a reply before nightfall. If he didn't receive one, he assumed he had to take control. The telegram was delivered to the bunker's command room. It was received by Martin Bormann, head of the party chancellery and one of Hitler's closest men. Bormann read the text, considered it a threat, and immediately showed it to the Führer. Hitler read it twice. Then he looked at Bormann. He said Göring was a traitor, that he was trying to stage a coup, that no one could be trusted. He ordered Göring to be arrested immediately. That night, the SS surrounded Göring's home in Berchtesgaden. They took him into custody. They took control of his offices and forbade him all communication. It was a rapid fall. From being the designated heir, he became a prisoner of his own regime. Meanwhile, Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS and one of the most feared men in the Third Reich, was also moving on his own. In the days before, he had initiated secret contacts with Swedish representatives. Through Count Folke Bernadotte, Himmler offered to negotiate a surrender with the British and Americans. He said he could guarantee order in Germany, that if the Western Allies agreed to deal with him, the Russians could be prevented from taking over the country. His proposal included keeping part of the party and SS apparatus to ensure the transition. The British didn't respond, nor did the Americans. But the talks didn't go unnoticed. The report of Himmler's movements also reached the bunker, just as Hitler was still digesting Göring's betrayal. Bormann took it upon himself to show him the papers. He told him that Himmler had also crossed the line, that while he was in his underground shelter, those who called themselves his allies were negotiating his replacement. Hitler lost control. He jumped up, threw the papers to the floor, and shouted that he had been deceived by everyone, that the men he trusted most had betrayed him, that there was no one left. He ordered Himmler's arrest, but Himmler was nowhere to be seen. He had fled Berlin. Hitler then demanded that all of Himmler's party positions be dropped, that his name be erased from the records, that no one else mention him. It was as if he no longer existed. In just 2 days, his 2 most important collaborators had been eliminated from the circle. Göring and Himmler had been part of the regime's core from the beginning. One had organized the Air Force, the other had created the SS, the camps, and the control system. Now both were out. News of these expulsions circulated quickly among the officers. Many didn't say it out loud, but they knew the end was near. If the leaders fell one after another, what could be expected of the rest? Joseph Goebbels was one of the few who remained loyal to Hitler. He moved into the bunker with his wife and children. He said he would die beside the Führer. He took notes, drafted communiques, and made statements for the radio stations that were still functioning. He said the German spirit hadn't given up, that there was still hope, but his words no longer convinced anyone. In the streets, the fighting intensified. The Red Army advanced block by block. The defense lines were thin. Many fighters were untrained teenagers or old men with old rifles. Hitler received reports every few hours. They were no longer maps, but lists of lost units, casualties, captured buildings, abandoned positions. He had few options left. In an attempt to stop the collapse, he ordered the execution of Hermann Fegelein, the SS liaison in the bunker, and Eva Braun's brother-in-law. He was accused of trying to escape. He was found wearing civilian clothes and carrying forged documents. He was interrogated by the Gestapo and shot. That execution sent a message: stay or die. There was no other way. No one dared to propose any escapes. There were no more contacts with the outside world. All that remained was confinement. Meanwhile, in northern Germany, Karl Dönitz was organizing a possible replacement government. He was in contact with naval commanders and trying to maintain some structure. He didn't know if Hitler was still alive, but he hoped to play a role when it was all over. Hitler, for his part, continued signing papers. He designated Dönitz as his successor in the event of his death. He officially expelled Göring and Himmler. He appointed Goebbels as chancellor. These were decisions made in the middle of nowhere. The government no longer existed as such. On April 27th, General Krebs, Chief of Staff, reported that Russian forces now controlled almost the entire center, that the Gestapo headquarters had fallen, that the approaches to the Chancellery were surrounded, that only hours remained. That night, Hitler called his closest aides. He told them he had made a decision, that he would not be taken alive, that he would die in his shelter. He asked for 2 poison capsules and a pistol to be prepared, one for him, one for Eva Braun. He said everything was ready, that the rest could do as they wished. Some decided to stay. Others looked for escape routes. In his final hours, Hitler no longer shouted, he only spoke in a low voice. He repeated phrases. He said the German people had failed, that they had not defended him, that they did not deserve to survive. On April 28th at dawn, the final confirmation arrived. A Swedish channel broadcast a bulletin. Heinrich Himmler had tried to negotiate Germany's surrender with the Western Allies. It was clear it wasn't a rumor, it was true. Hitler said nothing. He just looked at his secretary. He asked him to write a last will and testament. In it, he stated that he had been betrayed, that he had done everything possible, that he had no regrets. That document was signed in a small, dimly lit room. It was also signed by Goebbels, Bormann, and several witnesses. It was the final act of Nazi power. The next day, Hitler and Eva Braun locked themselves in their room. They closed the door. A few minutes later, a shot was heard, then silence. The bodies were taken to the Chancellery garden. They were doused with gasoline and burned. It was Hitler's last order that his body not be left behind. Göring, arrested, would be released days later by American troops. Himmler, captured by the British, committed suicide with poison before being interrogated. The Third Reich had ended, and it had ended not only with bombs but with betrayals. The structure that had seemed made of iron had been broken from within. What the enemies didn't break, their own leaders destroyed. The total collapse, the bunker becomes a tomb. On April 28, 1945, the Chancellery bunker in Berlin was isolated. Explosions shook the surface every few minutes. The underground walls vibrated with each blow. The floor was covered with dust, debris, and dangling cables. The air was thick and difficult to breathe. Inside, Hitler spent most of his time locked in his private room. He slept little. He paced. His face was pale, haggard, and his body hunched. His left hand trembled constantly. He barely ate. He only spoke to a few people. Eva Braun remained at his side. She didn't complain. She didn't ask for anything. She sat silently, accompanied him to the table, and listened without interrupting. She had decided to stay with him until the end. The other inhabitants of the bunker lived between routine and waiting. Hitler's aides, such as Heinz Linger and Otto Gunscher, continued to mechanically carry out orders. Cooks prepared simple meals. Some soldiers stood guard in the corridors, but no one believed in a way out anymore. General Krebs continued to receive reports from the front. Worse news arrived every hour. The Red Army had broken through all lines. The center of Berlin was already a battlefield. There were no reinforcements. There were no escape routes. On April 29th, at dawn, Hitler summoned his secretary, Traudl Junge. He dictated his political testament. In that document, he left precise instructions on the succession. He designated Dönitz as head of state and Goebbels as head of government. He expelled Himmler and Göring from the party. He thanked a few, then he dictated his personal testament. He left everything to Eva Braun. Those present signed: Junge, Bormann, Goebbels, and several others. It was a formal ceremony without solemnity. No one said anything. When he finished, Hitler stood up and returned to his room. That same day, Hitler and Eva Braun were married. It was a quick ceremony inside the bunker before a state official. She signed her new surname, Eva Hitler. There were no guests, no toasts, no music, just a few words and 2 signatures. As he left, Hitler greeted those present. His face was motionless. He said the end was near. In the following hours, he began giving final orders. He asked that gasoline be prepared, that a place be chosen to burn the bodies, that someone take care of that when it was all over. Gunsche was given that task. Hitler called his aides one by one. He gave them the choice of staying or leaving. Some chose to leave, others said they would accompany him to the end. No one was pressured, only loyalty was required. Goebbels and his wife Magda decided to stay. They went down to the bunker with their 6 children. The children didn't know what was happening. They played in the hallways, talked in low voices, and hugged each other. That evening, General Weidling was summoned to the bunker. He explained that there weren't enough troops left, that the city was divided into pockets, that there was no ammunition, that surrender was inevitable. Hitler didn't reply, he just nodded. On the morning of April 30th, Hitler had breakfast with Eva Braun. It was a simple meal. Then they said goodbye to the staff. They shook hands with each other. Hitler thanked his aides. Eva smiled, although her eyes were red. At noon, they entered his room together. They closed the door. No one else entered. Several minutes passed. Then a shot was heard. Gunsche and Linger entered. They found the bodies on the sofa. Eva had taken poison. Hitler had shot himself in the head. Everything was just as he had indicated. They wrapped them in blankets. The bodies were taken to the outside garden. There they were doused with gasoline and set on fire. Flames rose through the rubble. Smoke mingled with the dust from the bombing. It was the end of the leader of the Third Reich. Inside the bunker, silence was total. No one spoke. Only the distant impacts could be heard. Goebbels assumed command. He gave a short speech. He said he would follow his leader's example, that he would not give up his family. In the afternoon, Magda Goebbels gathered her children in a room. She gave them sedatives. Then, with the help of an SS doctor, she gave them cyanide. One by one, the children died in their sleep. No one heard them cry. Afterward, Goebbels and Magda went up to the garden. There they committed suicide with a pistol and poison. Their bodies were also burned, though without complete success. The remains were left half-charred against a wall. The remaining officers gathered. Some planned to escape. Others didn't know what to do. Bormann disappeared. It was said that he had died trying to escape. Krebs tried to negotiate surrender with the Russians, but no agreement was reached. Then he committed suicide. On May 1st, Soviet troops were already inside the bunker. They found empty rooms, torn papers, destroyed furniture. Corpses were strewn about. The air was unbreathable. The floor was covered in blood and dust. Thus ended the center of Nazi power. Not in a conference room, not on a battlefield, but in an underground shelter amid screams, betrayals, and fire. The Third Reich, which had promised 1,000 years, lasted barely 12, and its last act was a collapse inside a hole underground. After the silence, surrender, trials, and the shadow of Heinrici. On May 2, 1945, Berlin stopped resisting. At dawn, General Weidling, head of the city's defense, appeared before the Soviet troops. He wore a white helmet and a handkerchief tied around his arm. He said the time had come, that it was all over, that Berlin surrendered. Russian soldiers escorted him to a command post. There he signed the documents. He handed over his weapons. He ordered his men to stop fighting. Some still didn't know Hitler was dead. Others sensed it. His radio orders could no longer be heard. No one responded from the bunker. With the fall of the city, the war in Europe could no longer continue. On May 3rd, British troops occupied Hamburg. On the 4th, Denmark and northern Germany surrendered. On the 5th, Austria fell into Allied hands. And on May 7th, in the city of Reims, France, the total surrender was signed. The document stated that all German forces would cease combat at 11 p.m. on May 8th. The act was signed by General Alfred Jodl, representing the German High Command. In front of him were Eisenhower, representing the United States and his British and Soviet allies. A day later, the signing was repeated in Berlin, this time with the Red Army commanders directly present. They wanted a copy for their records. They wanted to make it clear that they too were in the victory. While all this was happening, Heinrich Himmler, still alive, was trying to escape. He had disguised himself as a private soldier. He was carrying false documents. He was captured by the British near Bremen. When they discovered his identity, they interrogated him. But before he could speak, he swallowed a poison capsule. He died within minutes. Hermann Göring, meanwhile, was arrested by American troops in Bavaria. He was taken to a prisoner of war camp. There he awaited trial. He denied having betrayed Hitler. He said he was only trying to fulfill the succession he himself had signed years before. In the following months, the Allies began collecting evidence: photographs, documents, testimonies. The goal was to prosecute the Nazi leaders for war crimes and crimes against humanity. An international tribunal was created. Its headquarters would be in Nuremberg. The trials began in November 1945. The defendants sat in a witness box. Among them were Göring, Ribbentrop, Keitel, and other leaders of the regime. The evidence was overwhelming. The images from the concentration camps shocked the world. Göring was sentenced to death but committed suicide the night before his execution. Keitel was also convicted and hanged. Several others were sentenced to life imprisonment or long prison terms. Some were acquitted due to lack of evidence. But the trial left its mark. The world already knew what had happened. In that context, General Gotthard Heinrici remained silent. He had been removed from command days before the fall. He had disobeyed the order to hold the front at all costs. He had ordered a withdrawal on his own. That saved him. When he was captured by the Allied forces, he was interrogated. He said he had tried to prevent further deaths, that he no longer believed the orders he received, that he had seen the disaster coming. He was not tried for crimes. He was not charged with anything. He was released years later. His image remains as that of an officer who tried to reason, who told the truth when everyone else was lying, who did not want to participate in the collapse, who tried to prevent Berlin from becoming a cemetery. After the end of the war, Germany was divided. The West was under the control of the British, Americans, and French. The East was in the hands of the Soviets. Berlin was also partitioned. The city was left in ruins. The streets were piles of stones, the buildings, charred skeletons, the inhabitants, living ghosts. Millions of people were searching for food. Many others walked aimlessly. Allied soldiers distributed bread, water, and blankets. Some abused their power, others tried to help. The occupation was a difficult balance. The concentration camps were opened. The gas chambers were shown to the world. The survivors bore witness. Their bodies were skin and bone, their gazes empty. No one could say they didn't know. In the squares of Germany, civilians were forced to watch the films, to read the signs, to stare into the mass graves. It was an imposed lesson. Many wept. Others bowed their heads. Some still denied it. Hitler's name was erased from schools, from the streets, from documents. His pictures were destroyed. His books were removed. But his shadow remained. In the rubble, in the memories, in the unanswered questions. The Chancellery bunker was closed, sealed, then destroyed. New buildings were erected on its remains, but underground, the hallways, the rooms, the stairwells remained. A place that became a symbol of the fall. In the following years, Germany began a process of reconstruction, new laws, new structures, new parties. But the division remained. The wall that rose in Berlin was more than concrete. It was a line in history. The memory of the final days of the Third Reich remained in documents, in photographs, in trials. The scene of Hitler locked in a bunker, surrounded by smoke, betrayed by his own people, became the emblem of the collapse. The figure of Heinrici, distant, prudent, remained as a contrast. He was not a hero, he was not a martyr, but he was one of the few who dared to say what others kept silent, that the war was lost, that continuing to fight was pointless killing. The end came not with a great battle, but with whispers in dark corridors, with decisions made in silence, with gunshots in closed rooms, with bodies burned underground. Thus fell the regime that had promised to rule the world. Not with glory, not with honor, but with fear, with chaos, with betrayals, and with the voice of a general who said, while there was still time, "This is over."